McDonald's is worried about its fries, not at one location, not in one city. Across the Midwest, Burger King is rationing portions. Wendy's is pulling fries from the menu entirely in some states. And the reason is sitting in refrigerated warehouses in Prince Edward Island, Alberta, and Manitoba. $2.7 billion worth of frozen French fries that used to flow south across the border without a second thought, until Mark Carney decided American fast food is not Canada's problem anymore. Trump demanded priority access to Canadian potatoes, claimed food security gives America the right to Canadian agricultural output, suggested Canada should guarantee supply to American restaurants before serving anyone else. He called it a strategic necessity, a matter of economic integration, a simple request between neighbours. Carney's response was 4 words: Canadian potatoes feed Canadians, and now 86% of American frozen French fry imports are on hold. Not because Canada banned exports, because Canada is prioritizing domestic food security and export diversification over automatic American access. The United States imports 1.44 million tons of frozen fries annually. 1.2 million tons come from Canada. And that supply just became conditional instead of guaranteed. Today, we are showing you why potatoes became the newest front in the Canada-United States trade war. How much American fast food actually depends on Canadian agriculture. What Carney is building that makes saying no to Trump possible. And why French fries are about to teach America the same lesson. Oil, lumber, and steel already taught. You cannot weaponize trade against the country that controls your supply chain. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Let's start with why Canadian potatoes matter more than you think. Potatoes are Canada's 5th largest crop, $2 billion in farm receipts annually. But the real money is not in fresh potatoes. It is in frozen French fries. $2.7 billion in exports. 90% of that goes to the United States. The United States does not produce enough frozen fries to meet domestic demand. American potato production has been declining. Processing capacity is concentrated in the Northwest, and fast food chains across the country depend on Canadian supply to keep their fryers running. Every major chain. Their fries are not made from American potatoes grown in Idaho and processed in California. They are made from Canadian potatoes grown in Prince Edward Island, processed in Alberta and Manitoba, frozen and shipped south. The supply chain is so integrated that disrupting it shuts down American fast food within days. Trump looked at that dependency and saw leverage. If Canada needs American markets for its frozen fries, threatening those markets should force Canadian cooperation on other issues, tariffs, trade negotiations, resource access, use potato exports as a pressure point, and Canada has to comply. Carney looked at the same dependency and saw vulnerability. If American fast food depends on Canadian potatoes, and Trump is willing to weaponize that dependence through threats, then Canada needs alternatives. Markets that buy Canadian fries without demanding Canadian submission to American trade policy. And Canada found those markets. Asia, Europe, Latin America, countries where population growth and rising incomes are creating demand for frozen potato products. Countries that pay market rates and do not threaten tariffs every time they disagree with Canadian policy. Okay. So what Trump actually demanded? Trump's demand was not subtle. He wanted Canada to guarantee priority access for American food companies, not just maintain current export levels. Guarantee them lock and supply agreements that give American buyers first claim on Canadian production, regardless of global demand or market prices. The justification was food security. Trump argued that integrated North American supply chains mean Canadian agriculture serves American needs, that decades of trade relationships create obligations, that Canada cannot simply redirect exports to other markets when American companies have built business models around Canadian supply. The implied threat was clear. If Canada does not guarantee supply, Trump imposes tariffs. If Canada redirects exports to Asia or Europe, Trump blocks Canadian potato imports entirely. If Canada tries to use agricultural exports as leverage, Trump retaliates across every sector of the Canadian economy. It is the same playbook Trump has used on oil, lumber, steel, and critical minerals. Identify Canadian resources American industries depend on. Claim those resources serve American strategic interests, demand guaranteed access at favorable terms, threaten economic destruction if Canada refuses. The difference with potatoes is that Canadian farmers and processors saw it coming. They watched Trump threaten oil, threaten lumber, threaten steel, and they decided dependence on American markets is a vulnerability that needs fixing before Trump exploits it. To understand exactly how Canada is executing this diversification strategy, let's take a look at Mr. Johnson's analysis. So, where exactly is Canada redirecting these potato exports? Look at what Canada has been doing quietly while Trump has been making threats. Prince Edward Island potato growers did not just sit around waiting. They got on planes, they flew to Indonesia, they flew to the Philippines. This was not some diplomatic courtesy visit. This was business, hard-nosed trade promotion. They went to those countries to sell Canadian frozen fries to Asian markets that have growing middle classes and fast food sectors, expanding faster than anywhere in North America. And here's the thing. Canada just wrapped up negotiations on a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Indonesia. Potatoes are specifically included in that deal. We are talking tariff reductions, streamlined customs, direct market access for Canadian agricultural exports. Now, the agreement is not signed yet, but the framework is sitting there ready to go, and Indonesian demand for frozen potato products is rising every quarter. Then you have got the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Canada has been in talks with that 10-member bloc since 2021, working on a free trade agreement. Those talks are still ongoing. But here is what matters. Agricultural access is at the top of Canada's priority list, and Southeast Asia represents 650 million people with increasing appetite for Western food products. That is not a small market. That is massive. Japan is already buying significant volumes of Canadian frozen fries, but there is room to grow that relationship. Japanese consumers already know Canadian potatoes. Japanese restaurants already use Canadian fries. And here is the beautiful part for Canadian exporters. Japan does not threaten tariffs every time it disagrees with Canadian policy. Imagine that. A trading partner that actually acts like a partner. Mexico is interesting too. Canadian potato exports to Mexico have been climbing. Frozen fries, fresh potatoes, seed potatoes, all of it. Mexico is part of the same trade agreement as the United States, right? But Mexican buyers are not sitting there demanding guaranteed priority access. They are not threatening to block imports if Canada decides to sell to other markets. They just buy what they need at market rates, and everyone moves on. Europe presents another opportunity. Belgium is the largest potato importer on the planet. France is the largest exporter. But European demand for frozen products creates openings for Canadian suppliers who know how to compete. And Europe pays market rates without treating agricultural trade like some kind of geopolitical chess piece. So, think about what this means. Every market Canada develops is a market that does not need American approval. Every buyer Canada lines up is a buyer that does not come with political strings attached. And every single ton of frozen fries that gets sold to Asia or Europe is a ton that American fast food chains can no longer just assume belongs to them. What does this mean for American fast food chains? Here is something people do not think about enough. McDonald's does not own potato farms. Neither does Burger King. Wendy's does not either. They all contract with suppliers. And those suppliers depend entirely on Canadian processors who depend on Canadian farmers. The whole supply chain works because it has always been predictable. You know how it goes. Harvest happens, processing happens, freezing happens, shipping happens, restaurants get their fries. Simple. But that predictability, it is ending. And not because Canada is banning exports or anything dramatic like that. It is ending because Canada is finally treating American buyers the exact same way. American buyers have been treating Canadian suppliers for decades as customers, just customers, not guaranteed markets, not automatic sales. Customers who have to compete with other buyers for limited supply. Think about it from the Canadian side. When Trump threatens tariffs on Canadian potatoes, what are Canadian processors hearing? They are hearing that American demand comes with political conditions. When Trump starts demanding priority access, what are Canadian farmers hearing? They are hearing that if they sell to America, they might have to accept some kind of subordination. When Trump treats agricultural trade like a weapon he can use for leverage, Canadian producers are hearing one thing loud and clear. Diversification is not optional anymore. It is survival. So guess what they are doing? They are diversifying. Asian buyers are paying the same prices without demanding guaranteed priority. European buyers are purchasing without threatening tariffs if Canada happens to sell elsewhere. Mexican buyers are signing contracts without claiming that geopolitical necessity gives them some kind of first claim on supply. American fast food chains are finally discovering something uncomfortable. Their fries are not automatically Canadian. They are conditionally Canadian. And the conditions include one simple thing. Treat Canada like a supplier with options, not like some captive source that has obligations. You are seeing fries disappear from menus, not because Canada banned exports, because Canadian suppliers are redirecting volume to markets that do not threaten them every other week. American chains that just assumed Canadian fries would always be sitting there available whenever they wanted are learning a hard lesson. Assumptions are not contracts, and contracts that get signed under threat. Those are not worth the paper they are printed on. Is this just about potatoes, or is there something bigger happening here? Potatoes are not unique here. They are part of something much bigger, a pattern. Canadian resources that American industries have depended on for decades are becoming conditional instead of guaranteed. We are talking about oil, lumber, steel, electricity, critical minerals, water, and now potatoes. Every single one of these resources follows the exact same logic. American industries built entire business models around Canadian supply. Canadian governments let that dependence develop because partnership seemed like it benefited both sides. Then Trump came along and turned partnership into pressure, and that pressure turned dependence into vulnerability. Carney's response has been the same across every single sector. Build alternatives. Find buyers who will pay without threatening you. Create markets that do not require American approval. And make Canadian supply conditional on Canadian priorities instead of American demands. Look at oil. You are seeing Canadian crude flowing to Asian refineries instead of going exclusively south to Texas. Pipelines to the Pacific coast, export terminals on the Atlantic. Every barrel that gets sold to a non-American buyer is a barrel that American refineries cannot just assume they control anymore. Lumber is the same story. Trade deals with Europe and Asia are creating new markets for Canadian wood products. American construction still depends heavily on Canadian lumber, but Canadian mills are finding buyers who will purchase without threatening tariffs every 2 years, like clockwork. Electricity. Canada is building transmission lines connecting Canadian provinces instead of just feeding American grids. Hydro-Quebec power, staying in Canada instead of automatically flowing down to New York. American utilities are learning the hard way that Canadian electricity is not some guaranteed resource they can count on forever. Critical minerals. Instead of shipping raw materials to American refineries, Canada is building processing capacity domestically. Lithium, nickel, cobalt, rare earths. Every ton that gets refined in Canada and sold to European or Asian manufacturers is a ton that American industries do not get their hands on. Water. This is the big one. The resource Trump demanded access to, and Carney declared completely non-negotiable. Canadian water serves Canadian needs. Period. End of discussion. It is not available for diversion south to solve American droughts. And now we add potatoes to that list. Canadian farms feeding Canadian priorities first. American fast food is a customer. Just a customer, not the customer. And customers who threaten their suppliers, they learn real quick that suppliers have other options. Why should anyone care about French fries in a trade war? French fries are not exactly a strategic resource, right? But the principle behind what is happening with potatoes that is strategic, because if Trump can demand guaranteed access to Canadian potatoes, what stops him from demanding guaranteed access to Canadian oil? If he can claim food security means Canadian agricultural exports have to serve American needs first. What is stopping him from claiming energy security means Canadian crude has to go to American refineries first? Carney is drawing the line at potatoes because the line has to be drawn somewhere. Canadian resources belong to Canada. Canadian production serves Canadian priorities. Canadian exports go to buyers who pay market rates and do not demand subordination as a condition of doing business. Trump treating agricultural trade as a weapon proves exactly why Canada cannot afford to depend on American markets. Today, it is potatoes. Tomorrow, it could be wheat. Next week, it might be canola. The pattern is crystal clear. Any Canadian export that Trump thinks American industries depend on becomes a pressure point he will try to exploit. The solution is not banning American buyers. That would be stupid and self-defeating. The solution is treating them exactly the same as every other buyer. No guaranteed priority. No preferential access. No assumptions that Canadian production automatically has to serve American needs. Just straightforward. Market transactions between suppliers and customers who negotiate terms instead of one side imposing them. American fast food chains running out of fries is what everyone can see. That is the visible consequence. But the invisible consequence is way more important. Canadian farmers are learning they do not need American buyers to survive. Asian demand exists. European markets are open. Mexican purchases keep growing. Dependence on the United States is a choice, not a necessity. And choices can change. So what happens next in this potato standoff? Trump is going to escalate. He always does. You can see it coming a mile away. Tariffs on Canadian frozen fries, threats to block all potato imports, demands that Canada guarantee supply or face retaliation across every sector of the economy. The pressure campaign is completely predictable because we have seen this exact playbook before on oil, on lumber, on steel. Carney's response is going to be equally predictable. No guarantees, no subordination. Canadian resources serve Canadian priorities. If American buyers want access, they can negotiate as customers, not as owners, not as some authority with the right to demand whatever they want. As customers competing with other buyers for limited supply, Canadian potato processors are already adapting to this new reality. They are signing contracts with Asian buyers, setting up partnerships with European distributors, working out export agreements with Mexican chains. Every single alternative market is like an insurance policy against American threats. And insurance policies pay off exactly when the risk becomes real. American fast food is adapting to smaller portions, menu changes, substitute products, anything to avoid depending on a supplier who flat out refuses to guarantee priority access. The adaptation is painful. Trust me, customers notice when their fries shrink or disappear altogether. Franchises definitely notice when costs go up or supply becomes unreliable. But here is the thing that adaptation actually proves Carney's point. American industries built business models around Canadian supply without ever seriously considering what happens if that supply becomes conditional. Now they are learning the cost of those assumptions. And Canadian suppliers who built business models around American markets without considering what happens when those markets weaponize trade. They are learning the value of diversification the hard way. Potatoes are teaching the same lesson. Oil already taught the same lesson. Lumber taught the same lesson steel taught. You cannot threaten the country that controls your supply chain and then expect that supply chain to just keep working the same way it always has. Threats create incentives to build alternatives. And once those alternatives exist, your threats become irrelevant. What was Carney's actual response to Trump's demands? Canadian potatoes feed Canadians. That was Carney's entire response to Trump's demand for guaranteed priority access. 4 words. That is it. No lengthy negotiation. No compromised position. No detailed explanation of why American food security does not somehow override Canadian sovereignty. Just a simple statement of fact. Canadian agriculture serves Canadian priorities. If there is supply left over after domestic needs are met, and Canadian export agreements are fulfilled, then sure, American buyers can purchase what remains at market rates without guarantees, without preferential treatment, without any assumptions that geographic proximity creates some kind of special obligations. Trump interpreted those 4 words as a declaration of economic war. Carney said them as a straightforward statement of policy. Canadian resources belong to Canada. That principle applies to oil. It applies to lumber, to steel, to water, to critical minerals. And now it applies to potatoes. American fast food running out of fries is the most visible consequence of that principle. But it is not the most important consequence. Not even close. The important consequence is that Canadian producers are learning they actually have leverage. Canadian farmers are discovering they have real options. Canadian processors are realizing that American buyers are not the only game in town. And leverage changes everything in negotiations. When Trump threatens tariffs on Canadian potatoes, Canadian farmers can point to their Asian contracts and European partnerships and say, "Look, those markets do not threaten us." When Trump demands guaranteed access, Canadian processors can point to Mexican buyers and Indonesian agreements and say, "We have customers who pay without demanding we subordinate ourselves." The balance of power in agricultural trade is shifting right in front of us. Not because Canada suddenly became larger or richer or more powerful than the United States. That is not what is happening. It is shifting because Canada is no longer dependent and independent. Suppliers do not accept terms dictated by threatening buyers. They set terms based on actual market conditions and sell to whoever meets those terms. Trump wanted guaranteed access to Canadian potatoes. What did he get? Market competition. He wanted priority claims on Canadian production. What did he get? The same treatment every other buyer gets. He wanted subordination. What did he get? Sovereignty. And American fast food is learning exactly what Canadian oil companies already proved. When you weaponize trade against your suppliers go find other customers. And once they find those other customers, your threats stop working. Simple as that. Canadian potatoes feed Canadians. Everything else is negotiable. And negotiation means Canada has leverage that Trump cannot threaten away, no matter how hard he tries. That is what American fast food is learning right now. One empty fryer at